everyone, Jim Davis here. Welcome back to As in Heaven, Season 2. This is going to be a little bit different show today. This is going to be a little heavier as we talk with some of the pastors who have been on our show about their experience with law enforcement. Justin Holcomb and I, we know from friendships with fellow pastors that those who are Black have often had some hard and traumatic stories. And while we were recording this season, we processed with a lot of our guests some of their interactions with law enforcement. And I do want to say, before we go any farther, that you're going to hear from these pastors themselves that most of their interactions with law enforcement have been good, they have been civil, they have been law-centered. You are going to hear some of them even communicate just deep thanks for so many of the great people in law enforcement in our country. So we're not doing this episode for the purpose of maligning or bashing police officers in the least. Our whole team, in fact, has good friendships and even family members who are in law enforcement. That being said, we felt that this season would be incomplete without telling these stories. You really can't know someone and empathize with them until you understand their fears and their wounds. We had one pastor this season with us talk about the loss of a child, and he said, so when I see the statistics of stillborns come up on the news in our home, I don't think about the statistics. I'm thinking, how does that land with my wife who has walked this journey? So that's the hope. We want to understand these stories so that we can understand how, when things like George Floyd are on the TV, that we can know how it hits our Black brothers and sisters. So we want to walk in their shoes. We want to understand their stories, and we hope that if you've never heard these stories before, that at a minimum, it causes you to put yourself again in their shoes and try to imagine one of these dignity-robbing or even traumatic encounters. It's very sad to say that there isn't a single person we asked this question to that didn't have at least one sad story. So in these moments, not even these men's pastoral office or standing in their community spared them these dignity-robbing interactions. And each of us, we also have fellow Black pastor friends who have had even more traumatic stories than the ones that you're going to hear here. So we don't say these things to malign anybody, but with context for why things are so often strained in our culture today. And we want to take the Lord seriously in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, blessed are the peacemakers. Peacemaking is an honest accounting of the state of affairs to create the baseline foundational level for understanding and empathy. So with all these things in mind, we hope that you will listen to this episode with the same measure of empathy and understanding that you would want if this had been your lived experience. So I'm going to hand this now over to some of our guests this season. Crawford Loritts, would you be willing to share with us some of your experiences with law enforcement?
Yeah, on a personal basis, I can answer it two ways. Individually, my experiences with law enforcement have been fairly positive through the years. Now, one time a guy gave me a ticket that I thought was, bogus. And I actually did think that there was a little racial profiling involved because he said I was going 60, 65 miles per hour in a 40 mile per hour zone. But there's no way I could have been doing that because I just came out of a gas station and where it was it was in South Carolina. And so, but he wasn't hostile toward me or anything like that. I just felt like, come on, man, you're spitting on my foot, telling me it's raining. So, so that was, but by and large, I am pro law enforcement. They exist for our safety by and large. Now, having said that, I've had the conversations with our sons and saying that my dad had with me growing up. I've had those conversations, and my two sons have had some unfavorable encounters with law enforcement, both of them, that were obviously racially motivated. Our oldest son was, when he's about 19 years old, was doing an internship at a large church in Los Angeles, and the pastor had a luxury car, it was a Lexus, and he sent Brian on an errand. And the cop pulled him over, didn't see this kid driving this kind of car, must be a drug dealer or whatever, didn't let him explain. Next thing he knows, he's spread eagled out on the sidewalk. my youngest son in Chicago, downtown Chicago, playing praise music in his car. And a cop pulled up to him and out of the blue just started harassing him, jumped out of the car. Just all kinds of nasty things said to him. So now I put that in perspective, and by and large, law enforcement, they lay their lives down every single day. They put their lives at risk, and the vast majority of them, they're committed to our safety, and thank God for them. However, racism is real, and it's in every nook and cranny. And you got to be particularly vigilant with the police department because obviously they have permission to use force, and so it's real. It's real. So, but I'm a fan of it. I love law enforcement. In fact, during all this time, my wife and I and several of us felt like the police were all getting a bad rap, and we did a few things to try to honor them and show our love and respect for them. But these things are not the figment of someone's imagination. When I think of my 6 grandsons, when white families send their son out and they come back home, you just want them to make sure that they don't get a ticket. They see blue lights, so I don't want to get a ticket. Well, sometimes with our kids, we have to wonder, okay, are they going to make it home at all? So that's a reality. That's reality.
All right, Isaac Adams, would you be willing to share with us some of your experiences with law enforcement?
Yeah, one comes to mind in particular. It was my wife's birthday a year or two ago. It was after some high-profile killing had happened in the States. And brothers, honestly, there have been so many, I don't remember which one it was. But it was 3:00 on an afternoon. She likes this nail salon in our neighborhood. So I was walking there. I'm realizing that, I think this is a useful illustration because, again, I live in Washington, D.C., in one of the nicest neighborhoods in the world. And it's going down. But so I have my coat on. I don't just frankly, to be safe, I don't wear my hood in public. So I'm walking, but I got my headphones in. And I'm stopped at this corner that I've crossed 1,000 times right outside this elementary school, 2 blocks from my church, where my office is. And I literally turn around and I was surprised and startled because there was an officer right behind me. And I looked at him and he just looked at me and said, "I need you to put your hands up." And I at this point, my heart is racing. I was like, "What?" So I take out my headphones. I'm like, "What did you say?" He said, "I need you to put your hands up." And the officer, he said this with a kind of pain in his face. But I'm pulled to the side and I have my hands up, and they're like, "Can you show us your ID?" And what I wish I would have said is, "You can reach in my pocket and get my ID," right? But I just said very clearly, "I am reaching in my pocket to get my ID as you have asked me to." So I get my ID, give it to him. 10 cops show up all of a sudden. It's just I'm like, what is happening? And I'm just trying to keep my hands up the whole time and not move, not doing anything startling. And, checks me out and says, hands it back. And then he says, I am sorry, you match your description. Now, there's a lot of complicated things going on there that I'm not going to touch upon because crime had been rising in the neighborhood. We can talk about racial profile. I understand. Like we were talking about in our episode, it's complicated. But here's one thing that's not complicated. I was happy and thankful that I left alive. Right? So I go get this certificate and I come back to my desk at work, right? Or this gift card for my wife. But then I come back to my desk at work And I look around to the other white pastors, and all of a sudden I realize they will never have to worry about that experience like I do. Because they're just walking around having a normal day. And one comes in my office, he's like, hey, how you doing? And I just broke down crying. I went home and just broke down crying. I was like, man, that could have been it for me. And like I was saying, in our episode, I got little kids, man. And this was 2 blocks from my office and from my church at 3 p.m. on an afternoon. Now, people are going to hear this 1,000 different ways. I'm not saying what so-and-so did was wrong or right or whatever. I'm saying this is the reality in a fallen world that's informed by a really painful history. And that was an experience that I won't forget and that I know has not turned out well for others.
Darryl, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your experience with law enforcement?
Sure. So what's interesting about that question is that there's a lot of different things I could share about that. Now I'll just share a few of them. And let me say first that, like a lot of people, the police have been very helpful in my life. That I've called them when I needed them. We've had break-ins at our house here in Tampa's core inner city, and so they've been very responsive. And it's good to know that you can call them, and so I think they're a valuable part of our community. So I'm grateful for them. So let me give two, just two. There's several, but let me just give 2 experiences that were really problematic for me. One is small, and then one was actually fairly big. The small one is when I was in college, and me and some friends of mine were just kind of walking through. I went to school in Boston, and so we were just kind of walking through Kenmore Square, heading back over to our apartment, going across the Beacon Street Bridge, and these cops, just about 3 police cars, just kind of came up out of nowhere, and just kind of showed up, asked me some very confrontational questions. And I'm gonna tell you right now, man, when that happens, your speech, it's just not clear. I mean, you don't know what's going on. You stutter, you stammer, you don't know how to, you don't know what's going on, right? I know it's cliche, but it's like, surreal, right? You don't know what's happening. And so we fit the profile of some guy who supposedly had mugged someone over in the Fenway, which is a park not far from Fenway Park, right next on the other street from Fenway Park, the baseball field. And you just felt violated, and it was just a moment. I mean, it lasted about 10 minutes. One of the cops that eventually got out of the car was black. And that kind of, when we saw him, we said, well, okay, we're probably not going to get killed here. Maybe. And it was just weird. We were kind of quiet a little bit afterwards. And so it's just, it's just unfortunate that it felt so. People looking at us, and they didn't pull their guns out. It was aggressive, but they didn't pull their guns out, or anything like that. And it took a moment before we could kind of clearly articulate, hey, we just left dinner. And but it was also weird that we kind of fit the profile, and we were just black guys walking through Kenmore Square on a Friday night. And were there lots of black guys out there? No. But still, we're just walking. We weren't running. And so that was minor. But it still was kind of, it's just not a fun experience. I think the more challenging one was probably, this is 2020, probably a little bit more than 10 years ago, around maybe 2008, 2009, something like that. Early one weekday morning at our home, there was a a loud knock on the door about 7 a.m, just bang, 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 bang. And I was like in the kitchen. My wife was upstairs. We were getting ready to go to work. And I was like, what is that? Who is that? And so I went to the door and said, who is it? And the voice just said, open the door. And I said, who is it? He said, open the door. And then after that, now both the deadbolt was locked, and also the doorknob itself was also locked, so you couldn't turn that. But I saw that they tried to turn the door. I could see the little knob move. I was like, what the heck? And so then I look out and I see there's this white guy standing at the door. There's somebody else behind him. I couldn't quite see him. And so just dressed in clothes, just guys. And so I said, who are you? What do you want? And the guy was like, open the door. And so then I just turned to my wife, and when she was upstairs, I called upstairs and said, baby, call the police. And so after I said that and looked back out, the guy that was behind the guy that was in front was a black cop. I didn't know they were cops at the time, but he said, hey, listen, man, let me talk to him. And the white guy kind of stepped back. And then the black guy said, excuse me, sir. He says, we're looking for someone. And our intel told us that they could be here. Here's our badge. I'm officer so-and-so. And he said, if you look, maybe you may see on the side of your house, we've got another guy walking around toward the back. Now I looked, and sure enough, there was a guy walking on the side. There's a bay window over there. I could see a guy kind of walking over on the side. He said, would you mind opening the door just so we could come outside so we can talk to you about it? And that was daylight. And my wife was still making the phone call. And so I came out, and needless to say, I was shaking. And so he explained kind of who he was looking for. I was like, well, he's not here. I mean, he's not here. We're here. This is our house. And he said, well, I'm sorry, and he didn't ask to come in and search or anything like that. He asked questions that I probably didn't have to answer, but I did. How long have you lived here? Things like that. And I told him at the time. And I kept looking over at the other guy, and he was not apologetic. He just kind of, he was like, okay, whatever. And I'm not saying that was racist. I'm just saying he was unmoved about the fact that he had stepped into our morning and just shook it. Now, let me say this. 2 years ago, in our neighborhood, there was a serial killer. In our neighborhood in Tampa, there was a guy who killed 5 people over the course of probably about 6 weeks. During that period, after my wife and I talked about it, I went, like a lot of my neighbors did as well, and I purchased a gun. I just said, you know what? I'm not going to go out looking for this guy or anything like that, but I don't know what is kind of, modus operandi is. If something happens, I'm at least going to defend my wife, blah, 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 blah. Now, if I'd had that gun before, and I thought these guys were about ready to do some kind of home invasion, this is the Breonna Taylor situation. And so, and I think that whether we think about race or not, there is a problem, and there's a culture of aggression and a presumption of authority in policing that assumes I can just give you direction randomly. I can ask you questions because I want to ask you questions. And you need to just deal with that. I was in the Air Force after college, right? So the Air Force put me through college. And so I was at MacDill Air Force Base here in Tampa. I'll tell you this, brother, the military police treats everyone with such respect everyone they speak to is sir, ma'am, whether you're a civilian, whether you are enlisted or you are commissioned, whatever it is, you get treated with respect. Now, if they need to bring force to you, they will. But their default posture is, I'm going to respect you and I'm going to ask you. And then if something happens where that needs to change, then it will change. I don't think that policing in the city police in Tampa and in many other cities don't typically do that. The sheriff's department here does a better job of that. And so, yes, I realize that had the situation been different, because if that had been today, I probably would have gone upstairs to get my gun. And then if I'd been shot and killed, it would have been justified. But the truth is, it was completely unjustified. And just like with Breonna Taylor, they should not have been there. It's the wrong place. And they were coming in, no explanation. And of course, there's laws in Kentucky. There's basically a stand your ground law there. You can defend yourself if there's an invasion of your home, unless it's a police officer. Then your death is justified. And so I would love to see accountability for our police that says that if you use lethal force, it's justified not based on what's in your mind, but it's justified based on the circumstance and the situation. If you went to the wrong address and that person pulled out a gun to defend themselves because you came in with force, that's not on them, that's on you. You introduced that, not them. And your miscalculation should not rule the day, even though they had a gun. And I think that in many cases, kind of what we could call consequence accountability hasn't been applied. It's really more about like, okay, did you do something that absolutely you should not have done? Well, if you felt like you were threatened, then it's justified. The Philando Castile case, to me, in Minneapolis, is mind-boggling that police officer was acquitted. It's mind-boggling to me. And so those are two experiences that I've had. I've had other cases of being, questioned. I've been pulled over and was talked to very disrespectfully. Once with my wife, daughter, and mom in the car. That was, I didn't say anything. I didn't say, why'd you stop me, officer? I said nothing like that. The opening words were disrespect. And my mom was trying to say to me at the time, as the man was talking, tell him you're a pastor. And she's back there in the back seat asking me to tell the police officer that I'm a pastor. And just because she could hear him, making what's essentially tacit threats. You better have registration on you. Don't let me see this registration's expired. That's what he said. Like, what the heck? And so those are much more minor than I think the other two experiences. Yeah.
There was this one time, and of course, I wasn't in Jackson. I was in the suburbs in Madison, coming right over the reservoir, crossing over the reservoir into the 55 side of the reservoir into Madison, where Lake Harbor and all that. And long story short, it was a mixed group. It was actually a group of white guys and black guys. We're from Belhaven, and essentially, we weren't riding with our seatbelts on or something like that. I'm not sure why he pulled us over. Maybe it was a U-turn. Long story short, we saw him coming, so we're thinking, oh, we need to put our seatbelts on because we're driving in the back seat. And as soon as that happened, guns were pulled out. As soon as we did this, because there was movement, and so yes, and even in that case, I would say only in that instance was the only time that I've ever had a gun drawn on me. The cop straighten up. I'm glad we had a white guy in the car. His tone could have been different. But he essentially was like, hey, when you guys make sudden movements like that, like, we can't see what you're doing. So just be careful in the future when you're doing that. But he was super nice and, all that. So that's all I got. But yeah, but that just, when you said never had, I was like, no, I've had a gun pulled on me. I just, but the militarization of police is the huge issue. We need police reform. But again, there's a lot of there's a lack of clarity around that conversation as well. And it's something that, again, libertarians have been talking about for a long time. Liberals are just catching up.
Dr. Ellis, would you be willing to tell us about some of your experiences with law enforcement?
As I say all the time, I say, first of all, let me preface my experience by this, that when you're in the dominant group, the systems of that society work well for you, that gives us best to you. If you're in the non-dominant group, the systems do not work for you as well. In fact, they can work against you. Okay, so having said all that, my experience with law enforcement has been on the side of it not working that well for me or working against me. Okay. Now, I also want to preface it to say that these police officers are human beings who bear the image of God, who probably see the worst of humanity. I don't think there's a cop anywhere in the world that doesn't believe in total depravity. Okay, so a lot of police, especially in today's world, they're only human. I mean, they sometimes they're under a lot of stress and all the rest of that. So I'll say all that to say, to preface it with that. Now, the other thing I want to say is that when you're in a situation like we have a multi-ethnic, multicultural society such as ours, the dominant group tends to look at the subdominant group and judge them by the worst of them. Okay, all right. And so that's the phenomenon that I call cultural racism. Okay, it's like you assume that if one is like that, they're all like that, and there's reasons why that happened. There's more today. We have more of a cultural clash, I think, than a racial clash. Okay, I can go into that, but we're talking about police right now. Okay, so here's my story. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, and I'm born in Brooklyn, New York, grew up in Gary. And I was out with my friends one night. I think I was about 16 or 17. I was out with two of my friends. One, I don't know if you know if the name Avery Brooks rings a bell to you. He was Captain Sisko on Deep Space Nine, and he was Hawk and all that. Well, his older brother I was out with. Okay, so we were out just having a good time. And we left Avery home because he was 2 years younger than us. Anyway, so we're out near a shopping center, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, about 5 police cars converged upon us with lights flashing and everything. And this cop walked up to me, he said, "Get out of the car." So I got out, and he put my hand behind my back and slammed me across the hood and put a gun to my head, just like this. He says, if you don't tell me where you put that stuff, I will shoot your MF brains out. I said, "What are you talking about? Don't get smart with me, boy." White cop, of course, And he kept me in that position for about 2 hours, threatening me and all the rest of this. And I and my friends, they had them cuffed on the ground. And evidently, what happened? Some people had robbed some stolen some stuff out of some trucks or something about a mile away. And all he knew was that they were black. All right. So therefore, he just saw the first black people he saw and he pulled me over. And it was really getting tense. And now the reason I survived it is because I happened to have known the mayor. He was a friend of mine. I knew the city controller. I knew the police chief. And I knew several members of the city council. And I started dropping names. I say, so-and-so is not going to be pleased with this, and so forth and so on. And after about 2 hours or 3 hours, or I forgot how long it was, but they finally let up and let us go. But then he wanted to run us in for being out after curfew. Well, of course, how are you going to go home after curfew when you're being held by the police? But it was a close call, and it just that experience so traumatized me that anytime a cop wants to pull me over or just to even follow me, I get quite nervous. And of course, since I've become a father, I've had to give my kids the talk, as we say. If you got your seatbelt on, he wants to see your wallet. Say, hey, listen, I need to unbuckle my seatbelt. That kind of thing. And so I would say that was a very unfortunate situation. But I'm not going to say that all cops are that way. It was a bad experience, and I've had other similar experiences, but not quite that traumatic. So again, part of this was due to a cultural clash, and the other thing, they all look alike syndrome. You know what I'm saying? Everybody in different ethnic groups think the other ethnic group looks alike. So one of the things that's contributed to this, I think, in the African American context, is that like every other group in the developed world, they have 2 or 3 subgroups. You got the achievers, you got the non-achievers, you got the anti-achievers. The achievers are those who live by values that usually lead to success. The non-achievers live by values that usually don't lead to success. This has nothing to do with character. And the anti-achievers, they would be criminals and people like that who are living, in the underworld. And what has happened in African American culture in the last few years is that, about 85 to 90% of African Americans are achievers. That small 15% of non-achievers, they have a dominant influence in the culture through hip hop, through gangster rap and stuff like that. I'm not knocking hip hop. I'm just saying a particular type of hip hop. And so there's developed what I call a cultural racism, the sense that if you see a black person, you assume that he's a thug or something like that, because we have a person in our church that was just roughed up by some cops just simply because he was wearing dreads. He was in a shopping center, and oh my gosh, it was brutal. And then they found out at the end that it was mistaken identity, and but he's still recovering from that right now. It happened like a week and a half ago, and so. It's unfortunate, and that part of it is the cultural clash, part of it is racism. I'm not going to say racism is the whole piece, but you can kind of understand, kind of where they're coming from. They're all paranoid and all the rest of that. So we got a lot of work to do. And there's a whole lot of other dimensions to it, too, which I won't get into. But I'll just say that, I have a story. And I still, when I see police, my first impulse is to be apprehensive. I have to consciously see them as my friends. It's not something that would come automatically. All right.
Dr. Strickland, can you tell us about your experience with law enforcement?
Yeah, that which is always a complicated question to answer. I do have a grandfather who's a police officer, who was a police officer. So I did see the badge, for the most part, in a positive light, because she was the one I saw the closest who was a police officer. But I remember distinctly one day, my cousin and I was 16. We were driving from our church, having played basketball, and we had to drive through a pretty nice, well-to-do neighborhood to get from the church to where I lived. And we got pulled over, and we were told it was because we had a busted taillight, and I had to get I got a ticket to fix it, and take that fix-it ticket, as they call it in California, to the court. And so turns out I had no busted taillight. I was profiled. We were taken out of the car. They looked through the vehicle and things like this. So that really tainted my view of police officers for a time. And to be honest with you, that really, it shook me for a little bit. And then sometime later, I was on a bus, and a city bus was riding with, just I think by myself, I struck up a conversation with a guy, and nice guy. We're just talking about sports and things like this. I love sports. I was a basketball player back then. And, and eventually asked him, so what do you do? He said, I'm a police officer. And that just sort of threw me back because I thought all those people hated me, that all those people were looking at me as a threat. And so I guess my fear was real, and my fear remains sort of like the realities of being Black in America remains as it pertains to law enforcement, because it's really easy to see the continuous sort of engagement with, law enforcement and Black men on the news. And so it's easy to see, you begin to become fearful of you being that guy. And so all that to say, I was able to see that not everybody is that guy who pulled me over needlessly. And I'm actually very glad, by God's grace, that I didn't get pulled over when I was 16 then, as opposed to being 16 now. I think my response, because that was pre Trayvon Martin, that was pre all this stuff. So my heart goes out to all the young men who are growing up now, who are seeing all this stuff going on social media now, in their interaction with police officers.
Jerome, can you tell us about your experience with law enforcement?
Yeah, so my experience with law enforcement has been good and bad. Generally speaking, overall good. I think it's important to note that. But I have been racially profiled, and it's an experience that was horrific. It's something that I'll never forget. I was literally leaving what's called a Gospel Announcers Guild gathering. And it was me and two other gentlemen in my car. We were dropping one of our friends off, and we were driving through Cary, North Carolina, and the blue lights came on. We pulled over, and the officer came and just said license and registration. And I asked, what am I being put over for? And he didn't answer my question. He made all of us get out the car. He called for backup. They began to pat us down. They searched us. And I, again, know why. And still to this day, I was never given an answer. It was just literally just being patted down, being searched, and no answer. And so it was a terrible experience, and I remember just as we got back in the car, pulled off, and, three Black men were talking. And then a friend of mine, a guy by the name of Abdul, was in the back seat, and he was just like looking out the window like, man, see, he was just angry because it communicated something about our existence. We weren't even worth an answer. We weren't even worth an explanation. Now, I know based on the Imago data, that's not true, but from someone who literally has the power to accuse someone wrongfully, he could have planted evidence. Thank God he didn't. He has a gun. And when you experience that, it does make you suspicious. And so I understand. And literally, and I was in a church plant residency, and I was telling a group of I was the only Black guy in this residency, and I was telling my friends, and these guys are my friends. I said, every Black man I know has been racially profiled. And one of the guys later came and said, Jerome, when you said that, he said, I just want to be honest, I dismissed you in my head. It's like, come on, man. No, I said, no, look at me. Every Black man I know has been racially profiled. My uncles, my cousins, my friends, all of us have been racially profiled where we didn't do anything wrong. I'm not talking about a headlight, speeding, pulled over and subjected to these things. And so the big issue, when we talk about these, calls and even the Central Park incident, is what this makes us feel is that my safety is contingent upon how someone white sees me. that my safety is contingent upon your perception of me sometimes. Again, not by all, but that's what it communicates. And so you're left to wrestle with that. And so, I say I'm over it from the standpoint it happened now over 10 years ago. But it's one of those experiences you never forget. But it doesn't mean I haven't given up on cops. I'm not going to paint them off with a broad stroke. But I do think, to kind of quote the comedian, Chris Rock, we can't, he said, we got a few bad apples. He said, bad apples, that's an interesting way to describe murder. Like that, we have to understand just the validity of the claims and then the potentially terminal results of this. So that was an experience with and I've had more than one, but that's the one that sticks out the most.
My experience with law enforcement has largely been positive throughout my life. I've not only known, but been friends with several men and women in law enforcement who have always been exceedingly kind, rigorous, generous, and I think at the end of the day, they just want to get home. And I think part of being Black in America is being catechized to understand the relationship with law enforcement officers has long been fraught with a history of violence and abuse. And so from an early age, I remember getting the quote unquote talk from my parents in terms of how we were to act and behave in public and how we were to engage law enforcement officers during a traffic stop. I think that's been part and parcel of what it means to be part of the African American experience. And, I think very few people I know have experienced run-ins with law enforcement officers that haven't altogether been pleasant. And so, of course, I have those. I think by God's grace, I'm able to walk through and experience those detrimental aspects of what it means to be brown and Black in America still alive. One particular occasion, two particular occasions, really, one being playing basketball with a group of friends and being kicked out of that place playing basketball. In large part because even though many of us lived in the subdivision, in large part because we were Black. And then on another occasion, I'd just come home from college and a group of us met up at a Waffle House in my hometown, and we were eating and having a great time. And we eat our meal, and about halfway through our meal, a local law enforcement officer walks in, and we're just thinking he's coming in to get a meal, and we are cutting up with the waitress and the cooks, and we've got the whole place rolling, laughing. We're just all having a great time. We finish our meal, and we tip our waitresses, we tip our cooks, and we're walking out, and this police officer stops us, tells us that the owner of the restaurant had been watching through the video feed, and that we fit the description of a group of young men who had not paid for their meal earlier. And so we were officially banned from that Waffle House location, even though all of us had been at college, attending our universities in and out of state, and none of us were the actual individuals in question. But that experience of quote unquote fitting the description was exceedingly painful. And so I think the last thing that I'd say is, I know not all police officers and law enforcement officers are bad, nor do all of them do their job without scruple or morals. It is unfortunate that we live in a day, and I think it's a sign of the brokenness of our world and just the fallenness of humanity, that we do live in a place, in a space, and in a world where those experiences are not rare, but they are the norm. And I think it calls all of us to, a higher level of not only gospel preaching, but Christian, ethically Christian living. And I think God is calling many of our brothers and sisters into the profession to do so with grace, with character, and with love.
Irwyn, would you be willing to tell us some of your experiences with law enforcement?
Sure. I'm fortunate in the sense that I don't have experientially in my life, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, a traumatic experience with law enforcement that I would say was based on racial difference. I had perspective, right? I had fears as a Black man. I received the talk as a young man from my mother, right, about how to interact with the police if you're ever stopped. One story that ends up being funny to me now is I remember I was in college. I was visiting some friends of mine who were at different colleges. One was at Albany State in upstate New York, SUNY State University, and the other was at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And so I had a rental car. I had a Ford Thunderbird rental car, which, you know, I mean, what, you're 19, 20 years old. That thing has some get up and go. This is it's the late 80s, you know? And so I'm driving on upstate New York between Ithaca and Albany, right? Cutting across the state. And I'm doing maybe 85, 90, right? And I'm enjoying it. It's open, right? And I don't see the trooper that is laying in wait for people like me, right? And so, again, right, upstate New York, I got certain perspectives of the demographics and where I am, being from New York City. And this trooper, and I see the lights behind me, and I literally start sweating. I literally start sweating and trembling, and I pull over, right? And the trooper comes up to me, and I look at him, and he's Black. Right? And so, like this breath just left me, right? But he could tell. He asked me, "Why are you so nervous?" Right? And I made something up. Right? I don't even remember what I said, but all I remember was the sense of relief that this was a Black New York State trooper that had pulled me over. I mean, I was I paid the ticket. I didn't contest it. I was like, I slowed down, right? I was like, that was, just the thought of like, oh, what might happen here as a young Black man driving in upstate New York, right? Getting pulled over by a trooper, and it's the middle of the day, but there weren't a lot of vehicles on the road, which is part of the reason I was going so daggone fast. Right? So I look back and I laugh about that, because I probably remember how nervous I felt, and it was because of an anticipation of a potential encounter with a white officer, state trooper in upstate New York, and it turned out to be something completely different. Yeah.
For more interviews, resources, and discussion questions based on the content you've heard, go to asinheaven.com. That's ASINHVN.com. If you liked this episode, please take a second to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, which you can do right from the Apple Podcasts app if you're listening there, or take a second to share it with a friend. Thanks again for listening.